The luxurious Jeon family mansion stood like a fortress, cold and imposing, much like its new master, Jeon Jungkook. Inside, Kim Yn sat nervously in her room, her hands twisting together as she recalled the events that had led her here. She had never imagined her life would turn out this way, sold by her stepmother like a commodity. Mrs. Jeon, Jungkook's grandmother, had appeared like an angel to save her from the miserable life her stepmother had forced upon her. But there was a price, marrying Jeon Jungkook, the cold and heartless CEO of a global conglomerate. Mrs. Jeon had believed Yn's pure heart and gentle nature could melt her grandson's icy exterior. Yn had agreed, hoping she could make the best of the situation. But reality had proven far more brutal than she had anticipated. The marriage had started on a bitter note. Jungkook had made it clear from the beginning that he wanted nothing to do with Yn. "You're just here because of my grandmother. Don't get any ideas. You mean nothing to me." His words stung, but Yn tried to remain hopeful. She cooked for him, cleaned their shared space, and attempted to reach out. Each time she was met with cold indifference or harsh humiliation. "Is this how you think you'll keep me? Cooking a meal?" Jungkook had sneered one night as he shoved the plate she'd made for him off the table. The sound of the plate crashing onto the floor echoed through the room. Yn swallowed her pride and the tears that threatened to spill, bending down to clean up the mess without saying a word. To Jungkook, Yn was just another gold digger, a woman who had married him for his wealth and power. He couldn't see her for who she truly was. A girl trapped in a life she hadn't chosen, trying to hold on to the fragments of a marriage that had never been more than a contract. Months passed, and the Cold War between them continued. Yn's heart broke a little more each day. She tried to hold on to hope, to believe that there was a chance Jungkook could change, that he could see her for who she really was. But with each cruel word, her hope faded. One evening, things came to a head. Jungkook returned home, drunk and furious, his tie loosened and his shirt disheveled. Yn had been waiting for him as usual, hoping to talk, to bridge the widening gap between them. "You're still here?" Jungkook slurred, stumbling toward her. His eyes were glassy, his breath reeking of alcohol. "Jungkook, please, let's talk," Yn said softly, her voice trembling. She reached out to steady him, but he shoved her hand away. "Talk? There's nothing to talk about," he spat, his words venomous. "I know what you are. You're just like all the others. A greedy, worthless—" "Stop!" Yn cried, her voice breaking. "I'm not like them, Jungkook. I'm not here for your money. Don't lie!" Jungkook shouted, cutting her off. "You think I don't know why you're here? You were sold to my grandmother, and you're fine with that because you get to live in a mansion, wear expensive clothes, and be Mrs. John. But let me tell you something, Yn, you'll never be anything more than a burden to me." The room fell silent, except for the sound of Yn's heart shattering. She stared at him, her chest tight, tears blurring her vision. "I'm a burden?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. Jungkook's drunken gaze softened for a moment, as if he realized what he had said, but the damage was done. He didn't apologize. He just staggered past her and into the bedroom, leaving Yn standing alone in the empty hallway. That night, Yn made a decision. She had tried. She had given everything she could to save their marriage, to be the woman Mrs. John had believed she could be. But she couldn't do it anymore. She couldn't keep living in a marriage where she was seen as nothing more than a burden. With trembling hands, she pulled a small suitcase from the closet and began packing. She didn't have much, just a few personal belongings. She stared at the wedding ring on her finger for a long moment before slipping it off and placing it on the dresser. Before leaving, Yn sat at the kitchen table and penned a letter. She kept it simple, not wanting to drag out the goodbye. Jungkook. I'm sorry this is how things turned out. I wanted to believe we could make this work, but I realize now that I was holding on to something that was never there. You don't have to worry anymore. I'm leaving. You'll find the signed divorce papers attached. I hope you find happiness someday. Goodbye. Yn. With the letter and the signed divorce papers on the table, Yn left the mansion, walking away from the life she had once tried so hard to make work. When Jungkook woke up the next morning, his head pounding from the alcohol, he noticed the eerie silence in the house. He groaned and dragged himself out of bed, but something felt off. As he walked into the kitchen, his eyes landed on the letter. His heart sank as he picked it up and read the words. Each sentence felt like a punch to the gut, especially the cold finality of her goodbye. He rushed upstairs to YN's room, but it was empty. The closet doors were open, and most of her things were gone. Panic gripped him as he realized what had happened. She was really gone. He had driven her away with his cruel words, the very words he hadn't even meant to say. For the first time in months, Jungkook felt a wave of regret wash over him. He had been so blinded by his own bitterness and assumptions that he had failed to see the truth. YN wasn't the gold digger he had believed her to be. She was kind, selfless, and had tried everything to make their marriage work. But now, she was gone. And this time, he knew there was no bringing her back. Weeks passed, and the mansion felt emptier than ever. Jungkook would come home from work and be greeted by the deafening silence. YN's absence was like a weight on his chest, suffocating him more with each passing day. He found himself thinking about her constantly, about the way she smiled, the way she tried to care for him despite his coldness, and the way he had thrown it all away. The divorce papers sat on his desk, unsigned. He couldn't bring himself to sign them, to make the separation official. But deep down, he knew it was too late. John Jungkook, the ruthless, heartless businessman, had finally realized what he had lost, but he had no one to blame but himself, and that was a regret he would carry with him for the rest of his life. It had been 3 months since YN left the Jeon mansion. She had returned to her quiet life, moving into a small apartment away from the luxurious and suffocating world she had been forced into. Life was simpler now. No more painful glances from Jungkook, no more humiliation, no more pretending that they could ever be something real. YN found work at a local cafe, where the days passed quietly and peacefully. She had begun to heal, slowly stitching together the pieces of her broken heart. Every now and then, she would think of him, of the coldness in his eyes, the sharpness in his words. But she reminded herself of the truth. John Jungkook never wanted her. Back at the Jeon mansion, things were different for Jungkook. After YN left, his life became emptier than he had ever expected. At first, he tried to bury himself in his work, convincing himself that it was better this way. After all, he had never wanted the marriage. He had always told himself that YN was just another woman after his wealth. But as time passed, the walls he had built around himself started to crack. Late at night, when the mansion was dark and silent, he would find himself standing in front of YN's old room. The scent of her perfume lingered faintly in the air, and he could almost hear her soft voice, asking him how his day had been, offering him a warm meal despite his constant rejection. He had been cruel, he realized now. He had pushed her away, not because she deserved it, but because he had been afraid. Afraid of opening his heart, of letting someone in. And now that she was gone, he was left with nothing but his regrets. Mrs. John, his grandmother, had noticed the change in him as well. She watched as her once arrogant and cold grandson became quieter, more withdrawn. She knew that YN had been the key to melting the ice around his heart, but now that she was gone, Jungkook was more lost than ever. One evening, Mrs. John approached him while he sat in his study, staring blankly at the divorce papers he still hadn't signed. "You miss her, don't you?" Mrs. John asked, her voice soft but knowing. Jungkook's jaw clenched, but he didn't respond. "I knew YN would be good for you," she continued. "She's a wonderful girl, and you let her go. But it's not too late, Jungkook. If you love her—" "I don't deserve her," Jungkook cut in, his voice strained. "I treated her like she was nothing. How could she ever forgive me?" Mrs. Jeon sighed, resting a gentle hand on his shoulder. "If you don't try, you'll never know. You've made mistakes, yes, but if you truly care for her, you owe it to her and to yourself to make things right." Jungkook couldn't shake his grandmother's words. For the first time in his life, he felt something other than anger or bitterness. It was regret, yes, but beneath that, there was also a longing he hadn't expected, a longing for YN, for the warmth she had brought into his cold world. He didn't waste any more time. He had to see her, he had to apologize, even if she never forgave him. So he tracked her down. It wasn't difficult, given his resources. He found out where she was living, where she worked, and one day he drove to the small cafe where she had found solace. YN was behind the counter, serving a customer when Jungkook walked in. The moment her eyes met his, her heart stopped. She hadn't expected to see him again, and the sight of him, standing there in his expensive suit, looking out of place in the quaint cafe, sent her spiraling back into memories she had tried so hard to forget. Jungkook's breath caught in his throat as he looked at her. She seemed different, stronger, more self-assured, and yet he could still see the remnants of the pain he had caused her, the hurt she carried because of him. YN, he said quietly, his voice filled with more emotion than she had ever heard from him. She swallowed, forcing herself to remain calm. What are you doing here, Jungkook? I need to talk to you, he said, stepping closer. Please, just give me a few minutes. Y or N hesitated. Every instinct told her to walk away, to not let him back into her life after everything he had done. But something in his eyes, something vulnerable, almost desperate, made her pause. Reluctantly, she nodded. Fine. 5 minutes. They stepped outside, the crisp evening air doing little to ease the tension between them. Jungkook shoved his hands into his pockets, struggling to find the right words. I know I was wrong, he began, his voice low. I know I hurt you, and I don't expect you to forgive me, but I need you to know that I never meant to hurt you. I was a coward. YN crossed her arms, her expression guarded. A coward? I pushed you away because I didn't know how to deal with what I was feeling. I told myself you were just another person after my money, but that wasn't the truth. The truth is, I was afraid of letting you in. Y or N's heart twisted painfully in her chest. And now? What do you want from me, Jungkook? Jungkook looked at her, his eyes filled with regret and something else, something deeper. I want you to know that I'm sorry for everything, and I want a second chance. I want to prove to you that I can be better, that I can be the man you deserved from the beginning. Y or N's breath hitched. A part of her had longed to hear those words, but another part of her, the part that had endured months of cruelty and humiliation, wasn't sure if she could trust him again. I don't know if I can do that, she whispered, her voice barely audible. Jungkook's face fell, but he nodded. I understand. I don't deserve your forgiveness, but if you ever feel like giving me a chance, I'll be waiting. I'm not going to give up this time. Weeks passed, and Jungkook didn't push. He gave YN the space she needed, even though every day without her felt like torture. He threw himself into work, but this time it wasn't to avoid his emotions. It was to become a better version of himself, the version of him that YN might be able to love someday. YN, meanwhile, struggled with her emotions. Part of her still loved Jungkook, but the pain he had caused wasn't something that could be easily forgotten. She needed time to figure out if she could truly move past the hurt, if she could ever trust him again. One evening, she found herself standing outside the Jeon mansion, her heart racing. She didn't know why she had come, but something in her chest told her she needed to see him, to talk. When Jungkook opened the door and saw her standing there, he froze. His heart raced, hope blooming in his chest. YN, he whispered, his voice filled with disbelief. YN took a deep breath. I'm not promising anything, she said, her voice trembling slightly. But I'm here, and I'm willing to try, one last time. A look of relief washed over Jungkook's face, and for the first time in months, He allowed himself to smile, a genuine, heartfelt smile. "I won't let you down," he promised, his voice filled with emotion. "Not this time." And as YN stepped into the mansion, this time on her own terms, they both knew that it wasn't the end. It was a new beginning.